Hey, everybody. How are you guys doing? I'm Ben Cook, the president of Acumen Learning. And I just want to share with you in the work that we do with a lot of big companies, global, publicly traded, multinational firms, all the way to even smaller firms. When we're teaching this concept of business financial acumen, there tends to be kind of a mindset in most of our attendees that I just want to share with you a little bit of insight that might be really helpful. One of the questions is, Ben, we, as an organization, there tends to be a real focus on cost, right? Why are we so focused on cost? Why are we always cutting costs? Why are we so focused on budget? And there's that kind of focus, right? That can feel like an overfixation on on costs and why the companies do it. And so there's something that I find really helpful in as a perspective around why companies do what they do. And I want to just share this, if you're okay with it, to establish some of the foundation of this idea. I want to talk about, at least really initially, the financial statement that tends to be the most prominent of financial statements that are talked about with companies or shareholders to employees, and it's the P&L, or also known as the income statement. A lot of different names for it, but I'm going to refer to it as the P&L, the profit and loss statement. And the profit and loss statement is just your sales, right? Costs, profits, just like you're budgeting at home, right? How much you generate, what you spend, and how much you have left over. So this concept is very similar to what you have to think about in your own life. But if I look at the average company in the S&P 500, right? Standard & Poor's 500, this is 500 companies across lots of different industries, even different sizes, but these are large companies. And let me just give you a sense of the averages of how they look when you look at profitability. And the profitability is really where this P&L is trying to communicate to the market, is how the company is performing with this profitability, if it's growing and expanding, things like that. So let me just talk about the P&L for a second, and then talk about what I think is really important here around the different levers that companies have to try to drive the P&L. So the P&L starts with sales, sometimes referred to as net sales, sometimes referred to as revenue, sometimes referred to as the top line, because it's the top line of the P&L. This is all of the sales that they generate globally from their customers. And let's just say the average company is generating $100. And for every $100, what's taken out in cost? Well, the first cost that gets taken out is this cost of sales, or sometimes referred to as cost of goods sold, or sometimes referred to as COGS. These costs are just the cost it takes for you to, if you're a manufacturing company, what it costs for you to manufacture the products that you're going to sell, right? It's the labor in the manufacturing, it's the raw materials, it's the shipping of the raw materials to the factory, right? It's even the quality testing in the factory, right? So all of the costs associated with the manufacturing. Now, if you're in retail, it's the cost to buy the product to put it on the shelf. So we'll call this cost of sales or cost of goods sold. But the average company, for every $100 that it generates in sales, it spends over 50% of that in this cost of sales, right? Getting the products ready to sell. What do they have left over, right? Your sales minus what it costs you to generate those, the products, manufacturing and getting the products on the shelf. Once you back out the 55%, which is the average company spend, for every 100 they generate in sales, they spend 55% in cost of goods sold or cost of sales. What they have left over is what we refer to as gross profit. And gross profit in this situation is 45%. And that's the average company's gross profit margin, meaning for every dollar in sales, once you back out what it costs you, the direct costs to get the product ready to sell, you only have about 45% left over to spend on other things, right? Other operating costs that it takes to run the business day in and day out. So gross profit is an important metric as an indication around how the company is generating sales, how relevant it is with its customers, how it's driving market share, but also what it costs them to generate the products to get it ready to sell, and what they have left over to now spend on other things, like this line, SG&A. It stands for selling, general, and administrative expenses, sometimes referred to as OPEX. And the average company spends about 25% of all of its sales in OPEX. Now, this is things like commissions for your salespeople, marketing, HR, IT, finance, legal, right? All the other costs that it takes to run a business day in and day out. they spend about 25% on that. And then these, many products, and companies, certainly product-based companies, have a product development or research and development line as well on this P&L. So you've got your sales minus what it costs you to make the products. That gives you gross profit. And then you got your other OpEx or operating expenses, that SG&A line. You've also got product development and R&D, when the average company spends about 5% on that. Now, some companies are going to spend a lot more than that, right? Tech companies, pharmaceutical companies will spend more than that. Some will spend a lot less than 5% if they don't have a real kind of heavy R&D bend to them. But what you have left over once you take out these costs is an operating income or operating profit. And you can see that once you start to take out these costs, they've got about 15% left over, or 15% operating margin. So you've got a gross margin, and then you've got an operating margin. Now, this is also known as EBIT. Now, I know you don't need another acronym in your life, but EBIT stands for earnings before, right? The profits before, the interest that you'd have to pay to banks and taxes you'd have to pay to governments, which are costs that the company incurs, but it's really not part of the core operations of the business, right? The operation of the business is generating sales and then making the product, selling the product, distributing the product, right? Developing the product. And that's how you get an operating profit. Once you back out interest and taxes, and as a percentage of sales, you have about 5% of all of the sales that you spend in interest and taxes. And what they have left over on average is about 10% left over, or 10% net profit margin, or net earnings we have at the bottom line. So you've got top line sales and bottom line net earnings, right? Bottom line on the P&L. And the average company has a 10% net profit margin. Some companies have a lot higher than 10% profit margins, right? Credit card companies much higher, pharmaceutical companies much higher, tech companies much higher, and some are a lot lower, right? Retail companies tend to be lower. You've got hospitals tend to be lower. Oil and gas companies, in most situations, are going to be lower, right? A lot of operating costs to try to get the oil out of the sand and out of the shale. But you have the average company sitting right about 10%. So that's the P&L. Sales, cost, profit. And gross profit tells me how profitable my products are, right? Sales minus what it costs me to make it. Operating profit tells me how profitable my operations as a company are. And then once you get to net profit, it tells me how profitable the enterprise is. So these different profit metrics, I think, are important for all of us to at least understand, because you're going to hear your executives talk about these and reference the trend of these. And maybe something might be interesting for you to do is take a look at these average companies' margins and then look at what they are for you guys as your company, your industry, your competitors, even your customers. It may be interesting to at least understand the economics of the other players in the industry that you're in. Now, that's the P&L. Now, the reality is, if I want to drive greater and greater momentum in profitability on the P&L, there's really only two things I really can do, right? So let me show you on this slide. There's really two things I can do. You can increase sales, or you can decrease cost. Now, obviously, we're trying to do both at the same time, typically. I want to grow sales, but I also want to better manage costs at the same time. But if I were to isolate these two scenarios, right? If I have an opportunity where I can increase sales 100,000, or I can decrease costs 100,000 through greater efficiencies, process improvements, cost containment, whatever. And if I have like sales up or cost down, how does 100,000 up in sales or $100,000 in cost look when it comes down to that bottom line of net earnings? Like, which has a higher contribution in net earnings? Maybe something for you to think about for a second. 100,000 up in sales or $100,000 in cost reduction. What would have a greater contribution in net earnings? Which one do you think it is? Sales up or cost down? Well, let me give you the answer to this, because I think this slide right here is a really important perspective to have as you're trying to run business successfully, but also connecting your role to the economic impact of the company. So let's take growing sales up 100,000 first. And let me show you what that looks like as you work your way through the P&L. So if I drive sales up 100,000, right, driving more market share, getting products to market faster, raising, getting more and more volume of product to customers, right? So I drive my sales up $100,000. Well, for every 100,000 I have in sales, well, I've got to make those products, right? I've got to get those products ready to sell. So on average, For every 100,000 a company generates in sales, it incurs about 55% of that in COGS, or cost of sales. What you have left over is just less than half of what you started with, right? I got about 45% left over, or 45,000 in gross profit. But I also have commissions I got to pay to my salespeople, right? I've got distribution of those products. I also have likely customer service and some other marketing spend. So again, for every 100,000 in sales, the average company incurs about 25,000 in that SG&A, or selling general administrative expenses. Now, I realize not every one of these costs is 100% variable, right? For every 100,000 in sales, everything's variable. But really, on average, for every 100,000 in sales, 55% is swallowed up in COGS, 25% is swallowed up in SG&A. So I'm just using the S&P 500 averages here. Now, for every 100,000 in sales, do I incur R&D or product development? Maybe, maybe not. But let's just even take that out of this example. So what are the most direct costs I incur by generating those sales? Cost of sales, right? Manufacturing it, SG&A with distribution, with commissions, with probably additional marketing spend. What do I have left over once I back those out? I get an operating profit. If you can see that 100 minus 55 gives me 45 left over, then minus 25 gives me 20,000 left over in operating profit. So every 100,000 in sales, once I back out COGS and SG&A, I'm really only left with about 20% left over. And then once you factor in taxes, and remember, we pay taxes based on our operating profits. We don't pay our taxes based on sales, based on profits. And the average company's, tax rate, effective tax rate's roughly 20%. So let's say about 20% of that 20,000 operating profit, we're going to pay in taxes. So that's about 4,000 in taxes. So what do I have left over at the end? Of every 100,000 in sales, I got about 16,000 left over. Now, that's neither good nor bad. It just is what it is. That's what the average company looks like when you're generating more sales. Those sales, you have to now incur costs. Cost of goods, SG&A, and taxes. Now let's pivot. Let's pivot to what the cost down looks like. So let's say, for example, we look for ways to get more efficient, more effective. We try to streamline different systems and processes. And we're able to find a way to reduce our costs 100,000. Okay, well, what does that do to operating profits? Well, have you ever heard the phrase, a dollar saved is a dollar earned, right? I didn't spend it, so I get to keep it. It's not in your pocket, still in my pocket. So that 100,000 down in cost gives me $100,000 up in operating profits, right? So now I'm going to have to pay taxes on this because remember, we pay taxes on operating profits. And like I said, the average company, roughly 20% tax rate. So let's factor in that 20% of that now additional operating profit that we generated. And we got to pay 20,000 in taxes. So what do we have to the end? We've got about 80,000 to the end. Okay. So we drive sales up 100,000. I get 16,000 to the end. I drive costs down. I get 80,000 to the end. Okay. Now, I promise, I'm not saying that cost down 100,000 is better per se. I'm just saying it contributes more to profitability if you do that. Now, obviously, we're trying to balance, these smart businesses are trying to balance sales up and cost down. But some of the reason why businesses get really focused, especially toward the end of the year, to try to generate more and more profitability, they start to be talking about more and more about costs and budget and having hiring freezes and travel freezes, things like that. I'm sure that's never happened in your companies, but it happens in lots of companies. And here's a bit of the reason why. Because if I generate sales up, I've got a lot of additional costs incurred and I have a little bit to the end. But if I can reduce my costs with the exception of taxes, I get all of it to the end. So if I look at the difference between these two scenarios, I have about a 5x difference between growing sales up and cost down. Now, let me summarize a little bit. How do you think about that 5x, right? All on that 5x is 80 divided by 16, right? What additional value does cost reduction give to profitability than just driving sales at that same amount? Now, some ways to think about this is if you're finding a way to operate more efficiently, effectively, and you find a way that you can reduce your costs 100,000, that equals to profitability what 5 times that in sales would generate to profitability. So if you're able to reduce costs 100,000 by some smart decision around process and system efficiencies, right? That equals 5 times that in sales. So be really proud and excited about what you've done to contribute to the profitability of the business by just trying to be more efficient and more effective. At the same time, if you're going to go to your executives and say, hey, we want to spend 100,000 on a marketing campaign or whatever it may be, well, we're likely going to need 5 times that in sales to compensate for what we just spent. Doesn't mean you don't do it, but the reality is just think that's the way the executives are thinking, that if I need to spend 100,000 in, say, R&D or say hiring of people, I'm going to need 500,000 in additional sales just to compensate for that spend. Now, again, this balance between sales up and cost down is a constant effort at balance for businesses. And this hopefully starts to help you understand that both sides of this matter, but it also starts to kind of clarify for most people to go through our class why there has a tendency for companies to lean closer to the cost-cutting effort, because it has such a contribution to bottom line. And again, like I said before, I'm not saying cost reduction is better. I'm just saying it contributes more directly, faster to the bottom line. But you can't just cut your way to prosperity. You can't just squeeze and cut. You really have to be good at thinking about both sides of this. And my recommendation for you is link your role to both sides of this. Be thinking about how you can contribute sales and market share and speed to market with new products and solutions for your company that can contribute to sales to the business. But also don't push off the thinking around how can you be more efficient and effective, because it has really strong also financial contribution to profitability. But if you can connect your role to both of these, I think that has a huge contribution on both sides of this equation. And some of your businesses are thinking more about, especially if you're early stage businesses, you're trying to grow. And if you're a little more kind of mature as a business, a little more commoditized as a business, they're going to be thinking a lot more around cost. But just be attentive to both. And if you can be aware of both of those and linking your role to both, now you're bringing some really sound business acumen and real strong contribution to the profitability of the business, which then allows you to take that profitability and invest more in research and development, invest more in hiring people, invest more in marketing and sales initiatives that can then drive more and more sales. The balance of these two together is vital. It's the way CEOs and CFOs and CEOs think about the business. And if you can think about it the same way and understand both sides of this equation, you've now elevated your business acumen. Now that we've covered this delicate balance between sales up and cost down, a few recommendations I'd love to give for you is that if you can link your role to both sides of this, what you can do to contribute to both of these really elevates the awareness about how you're connecting to the economic performance of the company and how that then frees up additional resources to continue to invest and innovate and expand and hire and staff and maintain a competitive advantage. Being aware of how you play a role on both sides of this equation, I think is really important to build some connective tissue on what you do every day to enable the company moving forward. But at the same time, when you're making recommendations, making a business case to your executives, start to employ some of this language, understanding the economic outcomes that need to be had if we're going to make some investments. And being attentive to these things, I think is really helpful to elevate your credibility and certainly elevates the rigor with which you're making recommendations up to your executives. It certainly is speaking the language they speak. It's the language they're listening for, and it can really elevate your credibility. So I wish you far more than luck in the application of these concepts, hoping this was helpful for you as you operate within your role and have great contributions up to the economic, financial, and strategic performance of the company.